One of the most daring and difficult engineering feats ever completed cost the lives of over 25,000 workers and helped America to take the position as one of the world's foremost powers. The Panama Canal was a project nearly 400 years in the making, and after other countries' failed attempts, America, largely under the command of President Theodore Roosevelt, completed what seemed to be an impossible task: to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through Central America. But why was this project so important to America that it would be worth such a frightful cost? Well, I'm glad you asked. I'm Dan Luer, and this is History for Humans. What do you make of this political cartoon? What's it saying about Roosevelt and his involvement in the construction of the canal? Not quite flattering and not entirely accurate. For one, TR was not quite that large outside of his own ego. But it does reveal a lot about the central role that Roosevelt will play in the amazing triumph that is interwoven with conquest, intrigue, and conspiracy, and a heck of a lot of dynamite. And we're going to be digging into this story today. You see, Roosevelt took it as one of his most important goals as president to see that America led the construction of the canal to shortcut around the long and dangerous journey around South America. But before we go any further, our exploration question for today's story lecture is: why was the building of the Panama Canal such an important goal for Roosevelt? And what does it reveal about America's new role in the world? So let's see how well you can muster an answer to this question at the end of the story lecture. But buckle up, because we're off to the past. So where we left off last episode, it was 1898. America had just defeated Spain and claimed colonial possessions for the first time in its history. But destiny was not written in stone. It came down, like all history does, by decisions and actions made by individuals. And it was now time for McKinley and Americans across the map to decide what to do with those territories they acquired: set them free or claim them as colonial possessions. And Americans were divided, as was McKinley. A bill to grant the Philippines independence after setting up a stable government was just one vote shy of passing. And for McKinley, he eventually was convinced that the Filipinos were not yet ready or capable of self-government, and that they needed the guidance, support, and governance of America. And while McKinley's sentiment should rightly be criticized for its blatant racism, it was true that when most nations were thrust into liberty and democracy after revolution, many divulged first into chaos and then into tyranny. So McKinley's concerns were not entirely unfounded, nor were his fears that other imperial nations would just take the Philippines for themselves. But the Filipino people fought fiercely for their independence against America under a man who became a national hero, Emilio Aguinaldo, a George Washington-like figure for them. The guerrilla war that America fought against the Filipinos was much more challenging than simply defeating the Spanish forces there, revealing just how close to their hearts their desire for independence and freedom was. But eventually they were subdued and became an American territory for nearly 50 years. However, some prominent leaders and thinkers in America, including Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie, formed the Anti-Imperialist League. They argued that it went against American principles founded in, what's that document? Kind of like a big deal, like a badge of honor for Americans. Oh yeah, the Declaration of Independence. The philosopher William James said America was about to puke up its heritage if they became colonizers like the European powers. However, their arguments lost out against those who were advocating for empire. The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, a book written by Alfred Mahan, convinced many Americans of the need to become a global power by strengthening the Navy, and this book became gospel to men like Theodore Roosevelt. And this belief was also leading the French to race to build a canal to strengthen their navy and ability to police their global empire, but were finding only death and disaster in Panama's dense jungle. The dream of the Panama Canal dates back to the early 1500s with King Charles I of Spain, when they were first colonizing the New World. But the prospects of digging a canal through the narrowest isthmus of Central America was just not practical in the 16th century. But industrialization changed that, and in the 19th century, France put forth the first real effort to build that canal, and it took it as a national challenge to do so. The French got to work in Panama shortly after the Suez Canal was built, connecting the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. And the very man who oversaw and led the engineering work in Egypt, Count Ferdinand de Lesseps, would also also oversee this project. However, the challenges that de Lesseps faced in Egypt were nothing like what he confronted in Panama. The incessant rains led to massive landslides as they tried to excavate the mountainous terrain, wiping out progress and men along the way. The thick jungle was unruly, and there was a lack of infrastructure like roads and railroads to move in and out supplies. And worst of all were the tropical diseases, namely malaria and yellow fever, that killed thousands upon thousands of workers. In 8 years, they made very little progress and then were bankrupt after spending nearly $300 million and losing 22,000 workers to disease. The failure of the French, though, seemed only to motivate many Americans who were hungry to put their stamp on the world, and no one was more enthusiastic than President Roosevelt. So America began negotiating a treaty to build the canal, but it was suddenly rejected by the Colombian government, much to Roosevelt's ire and fury. Shortly thereafter, though, rebels in Panama were fighting for freedom from the Colombians, who at the time controlled Panama. And as the rebellion began, the American Navy was on the scene at the perfect time and blocked the Colombian attack on the Panamanians. Recall our anchor image and the gunboats at Roosevelt's feet, the new treaty sign, and Roosevelt dumping dirt on Bogota, the capital of Colombia, and it should be making more sense now. With America's protection, the Republic of Panama declared independence, and a new treaty was signed granting America control of the canal zone. Now, just what level of involvement Roosevelt had with coordinating the revolt is debated by historians, but many consider it an act of war. Roosevelt himself even stated, "I took the canal and left Congress to debate, and while the debate goes on, the canal does too," seeming to admit some definite responsibility, but he thought the canal would become so important for the world that any wrongdoing would be forgotten or forgiven. And it was there in Panama that provided the clearest example of Roosevelt's foreign policy, dubbed the Big Stick, after an African proverb that he loved, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far." And indeed, Roosevelt's Big Stick was getting plenty of at-bats across Latin America and forever changing America's position in the world. If McKinley was a reluctant imperialist, Roosevelt, who came into power after McKinley's assassination, was a proud and adamant one. Roosevelt believed America's new role as a world power was not just beneficial for America, but for any of the colonies that it possessed as well. And it is true that in American territories, a lot of effort and money went towards noble ends. In places like Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, American engineers and resources built improved infrastructure, schools, and public education, and performed miracles in public health that saved countless lives. But surely America benefited as well, with new access to resources, markets, and increased position in the world, and fundamentally these countries were largely being ruled against their wills, despite whatever benefits they received. When Roosevelt first came into the presidency, he wanted to send a message to Europeans that the US would not tolerate their interference in any country in the Western Hemisphere. This had actually been policy since 1820 with the Monroe Doctrine, but the problem was that at the time, the US didn't really have the means to enforce it, so it was violated frequently. But things had changed by the time Roosevelt came into office, and he was ready to let Europe know it, and announced the Roosevelt Corollary that pretty much stated any chronic wrongdoings by a Latin American nation would require intervention by the United States, who had a right to assume the role of an international police force. This was the Monroe Doctrine 2.0, updated for the new century. So when Santo Domingo failed repeatedly to pay its debts to Germany, Britain, and others, and as those nations were ready to intervene, Roosevelt beat them to the punch. The American military took control of the custom houses to manage the payments and other affairs in the country. This was the first swing of the Big Stick, but it wouldn't be the last. And back in Panama, American engineers were running into the same problems that prevented France from completing the canal. The man that Roosevelt put in charge of the canal's construction was a railroad engineer named John Wallace. But his men too were falling from diseases, and construction was moving at a snail's pace. When he resigned, Roosevelt feared the project might just be impossible, but it was actually a blessing in disguise. Lieutenant Colonel George Washington Goethals became the new chief engineer, and maybe more importantly, Colonel William C. Gorgas was hired to manage public health and battle against the diseases plaguing the workforce and the people of Panama. It was only recently learned that mosquitoes were the major carriers of tropical diseases, and Gorgas went to war against those buzzing tyrants. From simple fixes like putting screens on the windows of homes and workspaces, to spraying toxic chemicals to kill larvae in water, and massive draining of stagnant water throughout the country. With his efforts, yellow fever was totally eradicated by 1905, and within the decade, malaria was as well. New American machinery was sent in to replace the aging French ones, and new railroads were constructed to move out the millions of pounds of earth that were dug and dynamited from the mountains and jungle. Workers constructed what was the world's largest man-made lake towards the center of the isthmus, with the world's largest dam and massive irrigation projects throughout the zone. And to oversee what he believed would serve as one of his ultimate achievements and legacies, Roosevelt took a trip down to Panama to witness the miracle in the making and grab a great photo op in the process. Here, sitting in a massive mechanical steam-powered shovel in a dazzling white suit, just like the ones you would wear if you were digging canals through the jungle. And this was the first time an American president ever traveled abroad while in office. But unfortunately for Roosevelt, he was not the president when the canal was completed. It was President Wilson in 1914 that sent a telegram to the canal zone that triggered the final explosion, allowing water from a dam to flood into the locks, and the canal was complete. It was a dream 400 years in the making, the ambition of many imperial powers, and after 10 years of American construction, the removal of 240 million cubic yards of rock and dirt, and the construction of over 3 million cubic meters of concrete, the canal crossed the continent and connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It was the most expensive engineering project in American history at the time, and cost over 5,500 lives, about 10% of the workers during construction. But when added to the 22,000 that died under French construction, it puts the tally closer to 30,000. The Panama Canal greatly expedited and accelerated global trade. It helped America's new navy better control its growing global empire and demonstrated to the world that there was a new formidable power on the block, one that would play an essential role in the Great War that broke out almost exactly when the canal was first put into operation in August of 1914. And Roosevelt's policies put America onto a course of being that of a global power and policeman that we still occupy in many ways today. But what role America will play in the world of tomorrow will be decided by a new generation of leaders, individuals and citizens like you, and what we learn from history will help us make those decisions. So thanks for engaging in some today. This has been History for Humans. And hey, thank you so much for watching the episode. I really appreciate it. And if you liked it and learned something along the way, it would be awesome if you just clicked and showed it, hit the bell, the whistle, the subscribe button, and whatever else there is. And for teachers and homeschool parents, you can head over to my website, historyforhumans.com. That's historyforhumans.com. And I have lesson plans and resources that go with all of my episodes, so you can save yourself a lot of time and stress and just enjoy exploring history with your students. And if you're doing a learning activity that you can find on my website, hang out because I got instructions in just a sec. So you can recall the territories that America gained from the war, understand the Roosevelt Corollary, but can you map it? It's time for a map attack, y'all. You're first gonna label America, the territories that it gained by 1900, locate the area impacted by the Roosevelt Corollary, and then mark the Panama Canal. And don't forget the key. It's pretty key. Okay, sorry. But then in part 2, you're going to get back on your historian's hat and you're going to read 3 short primary sources. You're going to identify if they're supportive or critical of American imperialism and intervention in the world. And then in the next box, you're going to identify what their main arguments are. Putting it all together, you're going to write a short argument of your own, whether you think Americans were motivated more by moral or selfish reasons to interfere and annex other countries. Do your best, think critically, and enjoy swimming in this history. I'll see you next time.